Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a Positive Choices Lunch and Learn. My name is Neil Hudson-Basing. I'm the Corporate Events Manager for London South Bank University. Before we start and take you through the Zoom functionality, I just have a short statement on respect and dignity to read. Everyone speaking at or attending a Positive Choices event should be treated with respect, dignity, and courtesy. Positive Choices operates in an environment built on equality, inclusion, and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback, and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating, and bringing communities together. Positive Choices does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour, including that potentially impacts or contradicts Positive Choices' reputation and values, will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any example of this behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. We want our events to be an enjoyable, safe, and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. You will see on screen, I'm joined by Helen, Chris, and Steve, who will introduce themselves shortly. Just to take you through the Zoom functionality, you'll see the chat box, and it's great to see people using that already. Please continue to do so to share your thoughts and comments throughout the event. We will be using that to share useful links as well with you. The Q&A box, please, if you have any specific questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box so we can keep tabs on them. And I'm sure Steve has factored in some Q&A time to run through those after his 2 presentations today. Finally, we have enabled closed captioning in the interest of accessibility and inclusivity. If you don't wish to see those, you can click on the little up arrow next to CC Live Transcript and choose to hide those subtitles. That's all from me. I'll hand over to Helen.
Thank you, Neil, and we're so grateful for your continued support. We couldn't have managed this throughout the whole of the plague or continue to do it without your unwavering support. Chris, I know you've only got a couple of minutes to be with us. Do you want to just introduce yourself and do a song and dance?
Yes,
or,
thank you. Thank you, Helen. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Lamini. I'm a RNLD. I'm currently working as a senior lecturer at Teesside University in Middlesbrough, and I'm also part of the panelists every time we have a webinar. Unfortunately, today, as Helen said, I've got to go to an academic board, so I will be committed elsewhere from 1 o'clock. But it's nice to have you on board. I know it's the first one of the academic year, and the numbers are going to increase and get better, but it's nice to have you all. I hope you enjoy this session today. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Steve needs no introduction, but I will introduce him in a few minutes, and he will introduce the topic himself. So let's just put something into context in terms of what we're doing. So we have tried to keep you all connected through the Positive Choices Network, through doing these seminars throughout the last 17, 18 months. And from the feedback we've had from you, it has been really rewarding for us and for every practitioner that has been involved. I had a meeting yesterday with some senior academics from other fields of practice who were saying, why haven't we got a lunch, learn and celebrate? And I went, you're not as good as us. That's probably why. Just to say, behind me, so everybody's got really fancy backgrounds. Mine's my dining room. Behind me is my husband cooking a curry for tonight's tea. So if you see something floating around, that's what it is. Okay, so Steve very graciously has agreed today to share his experiences of stroke. Now, he's sat on stairs, so he has promised me that he's going to do the Sound of Music, goodbye, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, adieu at some stage, sat on the stairs in terms of where he's presenting. But the thing that Steve won't mind me saying, and because he shared it publicly earlier in this week, is that he forgot that it was his 6th year anniversary post CVA. And I think that deserves a real round of applause, not only for being healthy, but also for actually forgetting. Because we talk about long-term conditions, we talk about people living with long-term conditions, we talk about co-production, co-facilitation, whatever, but often as healthcare professionals we make Padmini, was it you that said you were an aged person? Yeah, me as well. It sometimes makes it difficult for people to think about what we used to do to individuals. So for people not to think that stroke is going to be a death sentence, that it's not going to be the end of their life. So then somebody's put in the chat that it must be difficult for a person with a learning disability to have a stroke on top of their other conditions. Yes, it is. And it is also very difficult for us as learning disability nurses to understand maybe what that stroke feels for them and how that is going to impact on their cognitive impairment. I am indebted to Steve for his willingness to share so much with his, not just his heart on his sleeve, but actually bring it into a professional context for us to think, well, hey, I never really thought about how that would impact on somebody with a learning disability. So without much ado, I do have to nip to do the day job in a few minutes, but I'll come back before the end of it. I'll hand over to my very dear friend, Steve Hardy, and to somebody who not only do I respect as an LD nurse, but I love as a human being. So over to you, Steve.
Oh, thank you for them lovely words, Helen. Cool. So I'm going to do two presentations. The first one is about a good example of making a best interest decision. Okay. So Neil's just putting up the slides. So, you know, I just covered the 5 principles of the Mental Capacity Act while I'm waiting. It's just, the first one is you assume someone has capacity. Oh, thank you, Neil. Next slide, please. Yeah, so every adult has the right to make his or her own decisions. Now, we must assume that they can do unless we prove otherwise. And we have to prove otherwise. We can't just say it. We need to have it recorded in progress notes, Rio notes, or whatever computerized system you use. But number 2, this is really important for people with learning disabilities. We must give as much support as possible and to make their own decisions, and in an accessible way, in a language that they understand, in a way that they communicate. So if it's an urgent decision, you obviously can't take the time to support the person and to give them the information. But if it's not an urgent decision, for example, I did a capacity assessment for someone in June, I think. And, you know, on the Friday, I talked to him about the decision he was going to make, gave him pictures, etc. Then I left the pictures with him and also some staff over the weekend, so he could have a chance to retain it. And then Monday, I went back to see him, and I spoke to him about exactly what I spoke to him back on Friday. So I believe, you know, he had capacity, but it was so important to give him the time and time to process the important information. Next slide, please. You probably know this really well, but people can make unwise decisions or eccentric. But for people with learning disabilities, if they're making a series of very serious decisions and there's consequences, we need to, I'm not saying that they lack capacity, but we need to make sure there is a real formal assessment done by a professional. Fourth, anything done for or behalf of the person who lacks capacity must be done in their best interests. And number 5, it must be the least restrictive option. Next slide, please. Well, basically, mental capacity is your ability to make a decision. So it's either agree to something or disagree with something. And it includes day-to-day decisions such as what you're going to have to eat for dinner, what you're going to wear, what activities you're going to do, etc. It also refers to life significant decisions, such as agreeing to have medical treatment, an operation, buying goods, making a will, or getting married, because these have quite a big impact on your life. So it's really important that we make a formal assessment of capacity. Next slide, please. Lack of capacities, this is what we're going to talk about today. A person lacks capacity in relation to a matter at the matter time he is unable to make a decision in relation to the matter because of disturbance in the functioning of the mind or the brain. Next slide, please. Capacity, it always needs to be decision specific because the information you should be giving the person, so the information the doctor's going to give me about having my appendix taken out is very much different from what the vicar may say to me about getting married. So that's why it's always decision specific, and it's always time specific as well. Because, you know, I sometimes, some people may have capacity at this particular time, 12 o'clock Friday evening or Friday night. A lot of people will lack capacity because of having a few glasses of wine or whatever your tickle is. And also people with early stage dementia. It's time specific. Yeah, cool. Next slide, please. Right, so I'm going to talk about, this is a good practice case study. It's a real case study, but information has been changed about the individual, etc. So you won't recognise this person. If a person has been assessed as lacking capacity, then any action taken or decision made on behalf of the person must be made in his or her best interests. And we all talk about best interest meetings, but when it comes down to it, the actual person that's going to implement the best interest decision is the actual decision maker. He has to, or she has to consult with other professionals, family members, and also include the person themselves. But at the end of the day, it always is the person. So in turn, so given having an appendix taken out, it's a surgeon. Having to see a dentist, it's a dentist going to assess your capacity. Prescribing medication, it's the doctor, and so on and so on. Next slide, please. All right, before I move on to Mr. J, there is also a statutory checklist. And this has to be filled out when making a best interest decision. It has anti-discriminatory practice. So you shouldn't be basing the decision on their age, their gender, any aspect of their behaviour, etc. If it's not an important decision and it can be returned to in a little while, you must consider whether they may regain capacity, do everything to encourage the person's participation, even if they lack capacity to make the big decision, but they can also contribute to the small items. Okay, and consult with others like family, key workers, and then other relative factors. And we'll go back the relative factors in a little while. Next slide, please. Right, other relevant circumstances. So this will actually take up the most of the best interest meeting or the best interest decision. So you have 3 titles. medical, so not just the outcome, but what will be the burden and benefit of the treatment. Social welfare, how it will impact for better or worse on the way the person lives their life, and emotionally. Yeah, so it's going to, how will it cause more stress, trauma, etc. Next slide, please. And it is recommended that you use a balance sheet. So on the left-hand side, you have the three categories: medical, social, and emotional. And then next to them, you have the advantages of making a decision, saying yes to it. And in the other column, we have disadvantages of not going ahead with it. And this really helps make the best interest decision, because you add up which column has the most scoring points on it. So if, for example, I had 10 points on the advantages and only 3 points on the disadvantage, well, then we'd go ahead with the decision. But the only aspects you need to consider, one example would be if I was receiving treatment for cancer and it was an operation, and there's a 60% of dying through the decision being made, or you could say 40% risk of surviving. But that makes a big difference to the decision. So some aspects will have carry a heavy weight to the point. Next slide, please. That's some information about independent mental capacity advocate. You can contact your local social services to see who your local IMCUT is. Around here, we get the services from an organisation called Power. They're the first advocacy service who actually are professional advocates. They've done training, but they're only here to represent and advocate for the person that lacks capacity. They're not the decision maker. Okay, and they should be consulted on serious medical treatment, or if the person has in supported living or some kind of care home, must be consulted on moving them. Okay, next slide, please. Right, it always must be the least restrictive and the person's rights and freedom of action. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is really sometimes difficult when I'm doing training about the best interest decision, because we do a lot of role plays or acting out the case studies, etc. But it's what is really about is the person's best interests. It is not about what would I do if I was in their shoes. If someone says that to me, well, they must admit they would be sent out of the meeting. They're not allowed to say, what would I do if it was me? And it's not based on our own values. So we can't apply our values to this person we're making the decision for. So it is always about what is in the person's best interest. It's not about what's in my best interest, your best interest, or what I would do if I was in their shoes. It's actually about what is in their best interest. Next slide, please. Right, this is about Mr. J. He's a 57-year-old man. He has mild learning disabilities. He displays some features of autistic spectrum disorder. And the facts are that he finds social relationships difficult. He's had some quite restricted routines, especially what he eats, and he's resistant to change. So that's quite common in anyone, but especially in people with autism. He lives by himself, but he has outreach support going in every day. Okay. Within the last few months, he's been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. He's been seen by the consultant, who has said that at this stage, the only treatment is palliative. So a decision needs to be made is whether or not, as part of his palliative treatment, a stent should be inserted. He was assessed of not having capacity to make this major decision. So we're holding a best interest meeting. Next slide, please. So people who are going to attend the meeting was the consultant, Mr. J's social worker, his IMCA, because this is a serious medical decision, 3 of his support staff, the nurse, speech and language therapist from the community learning disability team, and a nurse from the palliative care team. All of them had spent time with Mr. J, some more than others, but they're trying to get to know him and find out what he would want. The social worker chaired the meeting, but the actual decision maker is the consultant, but he's doing the right, or she is doing the right thing to do. He's consulting with everybody who has a great interest in his life and well-being. Okay, so the specific question, whether all the appropriate treatments were being made available to Mr. J, whether or not capacity could be gained if more support was given, and whether Mr. J had been given the opportunity and support to participate in the decision about his treatment. So we spoke about this. Mr. J had been seen by a consultant who considered the full range of options available to someone at this stage of the disease, and learning disabilities did have no impact on the decision going to be made. His family, they weren't in contact with him, but an IMCA was instructed for him. The IMCA attended the meetings with the consultant together with a member of the support members of the support team. Next slide, please. Okay. The consultant asked Mr. J's social worker, can he call a meeting of all those involved in order to bring together all the relevant information. So we're going to consider his medical aspects, social work aspects, and emotional aspects. Okay. There was agreement that Mr. J did not have capacity to make the decision at this point in time, and he is unlikely to regain capacity regarding this decision. Next slide, please. However, many present at the meeting thought that with enough time and information was presented in a way that he understood, that he might be able to make some aspects of the decision for himself. The problem was that his condition might deteriorate, and quite quickly, at the point where a decision had to be made as a matter of urgency. So, for example, I often get asked, well, why can't you hold an IMCA in A&E departments? Well, an urgent decision is, the decision needs to be made on their best interest here and now. We won't have time to call out an IMCA for them to get to know the person, etc. So that's one of the reasons we can't have IMCAs representing people in A&Es. But Mr. J did have one. On the basis, the meeting decided it could take a decision to act in his best interests, as long as they kept monitoring whether or not he gained capacity to make the decision for himself. If he did not have capacity by the time the decision was needed to be made, they would proceed in his best interests, and if they did gain capacity, then the decision would be made by him. The social worker would be responsible for monitoring this. Next slide, please. The support staff and the GP would continue to try to help Mr. J understand what was going on and talking to him about what he would likely to be happening. Mr. J was terminally ill. However, there was a different view as to whether it would be best for Mr. J to undergo the intervention at all, i.e. the stent. This was because people needed information about whether treatment would alleviate his symptoms. So we already know it would not cure him, or whether the treatment itself would be more distressing than no treatment apart from the pain relief. Mr. J's social worker had known him for a long time and said that he was always found it very difficult when there was changes in his life or routines. However, he had accepted some more support in recent months, and he changed some of his eating habits when suggested to him, and showing different foods which he would be able to swallow. Next slide, please. Mr. J never made any sort of written statement or verbal statement about how he would like to be treated should this situation occur. He knows he has cancer, but he said that he doesn't want to talk about this. He's made it difficult to increase his capacity because he doesn't want to talk about it. But people who know him well are still trying to help him understand the illness and the options for treatment. He's lost quite a bit of weight and is sometimes sick after eating. He doesn't talk about this either, and nor does it seem to be upset when he is sick. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to go through, I'll give you quite a bit of information about Mr. J and the decision to insert a stent. So we're going to go through the statutory checklist. Can you press the go button, please, Neil? The statutory checklist. So, is the decision based on the person's age or appearance? In determination for the purpose of this act, it is in the person's best interest that the person making a decision must not make it merely on the basis of a condition of his, an aspect of his behaviour, etc. Okay. So, what aspects might lead to Mr. J if this happens? So, Mr. J has been seen by a consultant, we know this, who considered the full range of options, we know this, and not on any stage of the disease. Mr. A had no family and an IMCA was appointed. The IMCA attended meetings, etc. So, in the first aspect of the statutory checklist, they got a good green tick for that. Next slide, please. Okay. Can we just keep? Okay. So all the relevant circumstances. So next slide, please. The consultant asked Mr. J's social worker to call a meeting. So we're getting everyone involved in his life. Social staff, support staff, doctors, nurses, etc. And an advocate. The relative circumstances were the medical consequences of inserting the stent or not inserting the stent, how Mr. J was likely to react to either having the stent and at this stage of the disease, and what impact either course of treatment was likely to have on his quality of life and welfare and emotions. Next slide, please. Okay, so he must consider, I'm sorry when you're reading law, they always talk about well, hopefully it's changed, but they always talk about it from a man's point of view. So it's not me writing the statutory checklist. So I apologise for that. All right, he must consider whether it's likely that the person at some time will have capacity in relation to the matter in question. Next slide, please. There was agreement that Mr. J didn't have the capacity to make the decision at this point in time. Yet, however, many of those present at the meeting thought with enough time and if information was presented in a way that he understood that he may be able to make the decision for himself. As we heard about earlier, the main problem was that it's a matter of urgency, and if this occurred, they'd need to make the decision on his behalf. Next slide, please. Right, so we must encourage the person to participate, to improve his ability to participate fully, and for any act done on his behalf, we can still involve him. He can't actually make the whole decision, but we're still going to listen to him, encourage his participation, etc. Next slide, please. The support staff and the GP would continue to try to help him understand what would be going on and talking to him about what was likely to happen. Next slide, please. Right. So this is an important part. It's not really included, doesn't have to be included in every best interest decision, unless it's a matter of life or death. But where the determination relates to life sustaining treatment, he must not, in considering whether the treatment is in the best interest the person concerned, to be motivated by a death to bring about his death. Hopefully, we always say there's a good, it's no on every single statutory checklist. Right, next slide, please. But the real reason that was included, this is before the Mental Capacity Act. So if I was in a coma, a vegetative state, but there was a slight chance that I may recover, but then my husband or wife, they would make a decision, well, you know, if he said, if the situation happened like this, he would like the machine turned off. And going back decades, the doctors may have listened to him or her, but now he cannot do that. Okay, he's terminally ill. However, there was no difference of there was a difference of views as to whether it would be best for Mr. J to undergo any intervention. This is because everyone basically needed more information, whether the treatment would elevate his symptoms or whether the treatment would be more distressing than the treatment from pain relief. Next slide, please. Okay, we must consider his or the person's past and present wishes. We don't have to base our final decision on this, but we need to consider them. Next slide, please. Okay. We know Mr. J's social worker has known him for a long time and said he always found it very difficult, and there are changes in his routine. However, he had accepted more support in recent months, especially with these eating habits. He'd never made any sort of written statement or verbal statement. He had no religious beliefs. He had lost weight and he's sometimes sick after eating, but this doesn't distress him. So that's what we know about his past interests and feelings about this decision. Okay, beliefs and values. How would these influence the decision? He had capacity. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Mr. J had never expressed any views in relation to how people should be treated or helped if he was terminally ill. Well, I definitely haven't considered, well, what would I do if I had a stroke? But I have actually had a stroke, but not until I experienced it myself. He doesn't have any religious faith. It's probable that Mr. J would prefer that any decision made would result in the least possible disruption to his routines. This would include staying in his home with outreach support and nursing care for as long as possible. This is because he has shown that he finds change very difficult and also finds it difficult to adjust to lots of new people in his life. So that's quite typical of people with autism. Next slide, please. Yeah, we must make every effort to consult the views of any family, his support workers, anybody that has an interest in his life. Mr. J had not been able to name anyone, should be consulted about the decision. Next slide, please. He hadn't had a power of attorney, and no deputy was appointed by the Court of Protection. Next slide, please. Yeah, Mr. J had no family. The staff cared for him. They must be consulted, as they were, as well as his advocate, as he or she were. His social worker knew him well and was included from the very early stages of this decision going to be made, as did the nurse from the local community learning disability team. So it's important to consult with everyone as much as possible. Next slide, please. Right, other relevant circumstances. So medical issues, advantages of inserting the stent. Okay. Medical risks of inserting the stent. What information would you look for here? Okay. Right, so medical issues, advantages of inserting the stent. There would be reduced risk of aspiration of food. There would be a reduced risk of him catching pneumonia following aspiration. Mr. J would have better nutrition and hydration, and it would be the esophagus, it would be kept open, allowing him to swallow not only food but also saliva. Medical disadvantages of inserting a stent. The operation itself, if carried out, there would be a 5 to 10% risk of death. Doctors always tell you the 5 or 10% risk of death. They never say 90% risk of survival, because there's a lot of research been shown that if you say in the opposite, say survival, the person is more likely to agree to have an operation. It could be painful to him. It could make him feel sick initially, and a stent could become blocked. But although not a medical emergency, it could become uncomfortable for him. Next slide, please. So the emotional issues. So what would be advantages of inserting the stent, or the disadvantage from an emotional perspective? Next slide, please. Right, so advantages. Mr. J would feel calmer and would be less frightened. as the current symptoms he was experiencing due to difficulties in swallowing would be well greatly reduced for several months to come. He would still be able to eat and swallow his food, which we know he really enjoys as a very important part of his life. He would feel less likely to choke, would he find frightening, especially if he was by himself. Mr. J was not worried about hospital visits or admissions, as going to the hospital for an operation was unlikely to frighten him. Without a stent, his death could be more distressing. Next slide, please. There's only one disadvantage of inserting the stent, really. He might feel more anxious if the stent became blocked. But if it was treated immediately, he could tell someone about it and he would get the right support. Next slide, please. Social welfare. So what are the possible advantages and possible disadvantages? So possible advantages. Mr. J would be able to have more choice about what he eats, and he really enjoys his food. He would be able to eat food for much longer. Again, this is only focusing on him, and the food is a big part of his life. He would be able to stay in his flat for longer and therefore maintain his independence. Possible disadvantages, the stent would require some changes in his routine of what he ate, but not significant changes. The stent could impact on his quality of life, causing pain and sickness. Next slide, please. Right. So, Mr. J, they went ahead with it. Everyone agreed, including the consultant, who was the actual decision maker, the social worker, the nurses, the support staff, the advocate, etc. They all agreed it would be in his best interests to have the stent inserted. So what happened to him? He kept his a reasonable quality of life for 9 months after having the stent inserted. He stayed in his flat for 9 months. Towards the end of that 9 months, he had to have support staff 24 hours a day. But, you know, for 9 months, he led the life that we believed that he would like. But unfortunately, we knew he was terminally ill. And after 9 months, he needed to go into a hospice and he sadly passed away. But we all decided that we made the right decision on his behalf because, you know, if he hadn't had the stent inserted, he would have died, first of all, much earlier. He wouldn't be able to have the food he enjoys, and he wouldn't be able to live in his flat for 9 months. He would have to go into care near enough right away. So I believe that we all made the right decision. And it's a really sad case. He did pass away several years ago, but it was after the Mental Capacity Act started in 2007. So we did follow the statutory checklist. Lasting power of attorney. I'll just leave you to read that because I will send you some of the slides. Next slide, please. Court of protection. You may have heard of this. It's become much more popular since the introduction of doles and the, I forgot what it's called. Oh God, I'm having a stroke moment. I've got word block. The acid test. Sorry, when the acid test was introduced, lots of people in supported living needed to be put on a doles, but only a court of protection can make the decisions. So there was a long backlog to go through. Okay, next slide, please. Excluded decisions. So these decisions cannot be made on behalf of a person who lacks capacity. There will be not be subject to best interest discussions. So no one can consent on someone being married or a civil partnership. So if you lack capacity, well, you're not getting married. That's unfortunate, if you believe in that. Can't consent for someone to have a sexual relationship. You can't consent to a divorce or dissolve civil partnership. You cannot consent to make an adoption order. And you cannot discharge parental responsibility in relation to a child. And you cannot give consent under the Human Fertilisation and Embryonic Act from 1990. Next slide, please. Court. Oh, back, we go back one. Court decisions. Some treatments are so serious that only the Court of Protection can make these. So not the consultant, etc. They would give evidence, but the judges would make these decisions. And this is really beneficial to people with learning disabilities. Proposal, withhold of artificial nutrition and hydration, organ, bone marrow, and this is so important, especially for females from the old days of the institutions, non-therapeutic sterilisation. So thankfully, hopefully, you will never hear of someone being sterilised with a learning disability when it's not therapeutically needed. Next slide, please. Yeah, well, that was a really, well, I found it a really helpful case. It went through from all the stages of the statute checklist. Yeah, I'm sorry if I had a stroke moments there. I got a couple of word block situations, but hopefully it didn't make it so difficult for you following it. Anybody got any questions?
So there's none yet, Steve. If anyone has any questions regarding this presentation, please do pop them in the Q&A box, and we can come to them at the end. But are you ready? Are you happy to move straight on to your other one, Steve?
Yeah, this one will be a lot easier for me.
No worries. 2 seconds, and I'll just get that ready.
Sure. So, life after a stroke. On September the 6th in 2014, approximately 1 a.m., I woke up, I was lying on the sofa, and something was wrong, and I didn't know what it was. Okay, so this is a short story of how I survived a stroke and the support I got. Next slide, please. Right, so I woke up, I was extremely confused. I can't explain what it's like, how confusing you are when you have a stroke. So I'll give you an example of what I did. I couldn't control everything on my right-hand side. So I believed that I just woken up with a serious case of pins and needles. I was on the sofa in the lounge, but I travelled to my bedroom, which is about 8 meters away. It took me over an hour to pull myself across 8 meters. I should have called an ambulance if I'd known what happened, etc. But in my mind, I needed to get to bed and have some rest. It was the wrong decision because I may not have had serious symptoms of the stroke, and I still have some now. But, well, it happened, and I dealt with it my own way. Yeah, next slide, please. Right, I was due to go to a friend's house in Chelmsford with my other friend, Claire. who was also a nurse. She's a mental health nurse. I got through to them, but she couldn't understand a word I was saying to her. In my mind, I thought I was saying, I can't go today because I don't feel well. But what I was actually talking about, I was talking about a day centre I worked in as a late teenager. I talked about Madonna and all other sort of things, but they were totally unrelated to what I was talking about and unrelated to each other. So jumping from Madonna to the day centre I used to work in, you know, from one thing to the next. It's sort of like people with mania, they experience. Claire contacted my brother via Facebook and he called an ambulance. I actually got up feeling returned to my right-hand side of my body. And I actually managed to get myself dressed. I had a wash, didn't have a shower, but I had a wash, cleaned my teeth, etc. Next slide, please. I was taken to A&E, where either fortunately or unfortunately, I know some of the staff there. First of all, my niece is the sister, or well, the charge nurse, whatever term you use. And also one of the band 5 nurses was one of my oldest friends. I was given aspirin immediately in A&E. They suspected a stroke, but they can't confirm this until an MRI. They did vital signs. It seemed like every 5 minutes. I imagine it was every 15 minutes to begin with. I was in A&E only for 4 hours. Then I was transferred to a ward. And I was quite surprised when I went in. I was pushed in on a bed. And I looked at everyone. And to my surprise, I was the actual youngest person in the room. That's the first time that's ever happened in years and years. Everybody was generally over the age of 60, even 70 or 80. Funnily enough, there was more males on the ward than females. I haven't looked at the statistics on strokes, but definitely at that time, people in Maidstone, a lot of men had strokes. Next slide, please. All right, I had really good nursing care. They treated me kindly. They explained everything that was happening to me, etc. I had brilliant and absolutely brilliant occupational therapy, and I really enjoyed going to all my activities and assessments. Yeah, and they knew everything about the Mental Capacity Act. A great speech and language therapy manager. However, I'll talk about my experience as a speech and language therapist junior member of staff in a bit. Excellent care from the medics. I can't remember my consultant's name, but he was from Germany. He clearly explained everything about having a stroke. He broke all the information down. And he was also had trainee doctors with him, and also as he explained everything that he was doing to me, to them. Because my friends worked in A&E, I was a nurse consultant at the time, so they knew my job. They knew all of my publications, but other than the OT, but there was no mental capacity assessment done on me, what I remember. I'm not saying they should have done a mental capacity assessment on my first 2 days or 3 days of admission, but as soon as I was ready to be discharged, they should have considered a mental capacity assessment, but this wasn't done. Next slide, please. Where it went wrong. So, you see the medication portable trolley. So I was really, really bored in the ward. And one night, the night staff, they were bank staff, came on. They brought in the trolley into my bay, and the nurse distributing the meds, she got called out to another bay. It wasn't an emergency because the way she was walking quite slowly, but she left it unlocked, and I had my clock on my mobile, and I started the time in it, and she was gone for 5 minutes 32 seconds. During that time, I could have had her struck off. I could have pinched so many medications and so many really serious medications, and plus anybody else could have taken them as well. So the next morning, I tried my very best to tell the charge nurse, but I had really difficulty communicating. But at least I told them. I don't know whether they took it further. Hopefully they did, but I wasn't asked to give a statement or anything. But the medication should definitely not be left open for well, if the person isn't there, it should be locked, and definitely not unleft for 5 minutes. Now, if anybody watches Gotham, that is the Joker on the right-hand side. And speech and language therapist, the manager, I said, was really, really experienced, really great, compassion, empathetic. But the junior member of staff, I think she just qualified. Honestly, she spoke to me like I was a child. I found her so patronising. And then our director of nursing came to visit me, and she actually experienced this speech and language therapist herself. And she said that she's the most unperson-centered member of staff I have ever met. Yeah, so that was a really bad experience of mine, the hospital. But at the end of the day, I survived, and in the general, I really got brilliant treatment. So except for that one nurse leaving the meds out and that speech and language therapist, it went really well. I stayed there for 2 weeks. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, highlights on life on the ward. I was there for 2 weeks. Highlights, actually going out of the ward was really great. So I enjoyed going for an MRI scan. I've never had one before. I wouldn't mind having one again. And also, I wasn't allowed to walk to the MRI scan. If you've ever been in the hospital, you need to be pushed around in a wheelchair by everybody. Occupational therapy, I loved doing their activities. I did cooking group with them. I enjoyed the assessments. And I looked after the man in the bed next to me, who had a stroke, but also a middle stage dementia. So I comforted him and worked with him really well, I hope. He was a kind man. That sinking feeling, the SORT assessments, oh my good God. Yeah, I've already spoken about how difficult I found that speech therapist. My own challenging behaviour. On the second week I was in hospital, I noticed above my bed, it says, when he says yes, he sometimes means no. And when he says no, he sometimes means yes. Well, I was shocked when I read that, and I ripped it up and threw it across the ward. They didn't put another notice up behind my bed. But my communication was very, very slow. I sometimes still, even 7 years on, I still get word block. But at least now I can find an alternative word. But for about the first year after the stroke, if you actually have word block, you can't think of any word at all to replace it or an alternative word. You just, your mind goes blank. Yeah, so it's a really poor experience. Next slide, please. Yeah, I was discharged after 2 weeks, but according to the OT, I wasn't completely competent to go back to my flat. I had to get back to my mum's house. It was lovely and caring, my mum and stepdad, but you can imagine that made me feel really difficult experience, and felt like sometimes, well, like, she's always my mum, so I'm always going to be her child, but she referred back to like when I was an infant some days, but most of the time she did really so well and still does. Next slide, please. Continued treatment for 6 weeks as an outpatient. I had community salt interview, who was actually brilliant, really good to actually find my second personal experience of speech and language therapy. They were so good, and they understood all that I was going through. I had 2-week OT interventions, which could be much better. For example, all she had to do, she told me to underline certain words in a newspaper, and that's the only thing she asked me to do. And my family was so supportive, but I also made loads and loads of mistakes. So it was time just before Christmas. We was making jam and the Christmas pudding, and I actually misread or misunderstood the ingredients and the how much sugar. So we had to throw them away once once they were cooked or made, because they felt so sweet, too sweet you couldn't even eat them. Also, when I went back for my outpatient to see my consultant, I realised that I couldn't see on my right hand side. So then I was referred to a visual specialist. So I developed something called hypnopsia, which means I can't see through both eyes or anything on my right hand side. She said sometimes people who had strokes get their sight back within 3 months, but after 3 months I went back and it was still the same. But the brain is an amazing organ. I can't believe that, you know, I don't notice it now at all. The only time I would actually notice I can't see on my right hand side is if I'm walking down, say I'm going to Bluewater, it's a big shopping centre in Kent. And if I went there Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock, busiest time, I would find that quite frightening, because all the people crossing my path, I can't see anything on my right hand side. But other than that, I do really well, and it's quite hard to describe hypnosia to somebody, because it actually it comes from when the nerve endings in the cortex at the back of the brain is injured during the stroke. It doesn't actually occur in the actual eyes, but that's something that's quite difficult in the beginning, but it really helpful hints and stuff what to do from the visual therapist. Next slide, please. After 6 weeks, I persuaded the OT team that I was competent and now have the capacity to go home, and they agreed with me, and they persuaded my mum, who did honestly need some persuasion. My communication was still quite slow, but it was improving. It went really well, but I did make mistakes. And also, what's quite important, I talk to you about the stroke, and I give talks about experiences of having a stroke. I welcome them. But about for the first 2-3 years after the stroke, I was embarrassed and wouldn't tell anybody I had one. But yeah, if you want to ask me any questions, yeah, go ahead. I'm more willing to help. Next slide, please. What then happened? It took me 9 months to go back to work. So 6 months on full pay and then 3 months on half pay. After 6 months being back at work, I found the job of nurse consultant very, very difficult. I was responsible for over 100 nursing staff and also chairing meetings, etc. So I asked, could I step down? And they very kindly turned a job, especially for me as a practice development nurse. So I'm not responsible for managing anybody, but I'm only responsible for helping them practice their development and working with the patients or clients or whatever term you use. My personality's changed. So my empathy, I can say I was always empathetic, but it's greatly improved. I do go out of my way now to help other people, especially people with learning disabilities. After this, I'm going to do some, it's not actually work, but a man I know with a learning disability called Peter. We're doing some work together for a conference in Berlin. I also do some work for voluntary work for Lewisham Speaking Up. So it's an advocacy group. But one of the problem is also I see a sense of justice. And if you have me in your team and something goes wrong, well, I'm sure you wouldn't like me then. I've sometimes overreacted. And when I've seen injustice done to people with learning disabilities, I now have adapted my behaviour, and I still act on anything I've seen or heard, but I do it appropriately now. Whereas 4 years ago, if I saw something abuse happening, not only would I call the police, I would send some rather bitter and rude emails to the whole team about that individual. But I don't do that anymore. And I don't care about what embarrasses me now. I used to hate having my photo taken, but I don't mind having my photo taken now. Yeah, and it's been 7 years. Yeah, 7 experience of good experience, poor experience, but a learning experience for 7 years. Cool. Yeah, and I'm glad I'm still here. And I believe having a stroke has really helped me. I would say differently 6 years ago, but it has really helped me now. Last slide, please. To conclude, 1 in 4 people die immediately if they have a stroke. 1 in 4 people have a major disability. So a physical disability or communication or sensory impairment. 1 in 4 have minor disabilities. That's me included in that minor disability. And then 1 in 4 make a full recovery. So I'm 3rd in the list of the stroke or survivors or people who died. Yeah, I'm the 3rd category. Yeah, so thanks for your time. Thanks for listening to me. If anyone's got any questions about best interests or my experiences of having a stroke, etc., yeah, be welcome.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Yeah, those stats, while kind of a bit alarming, you know, there's something that you've actually gone through. So thank you for sharing. We've got some comments in the chat box. I'm so sorry to your experiences, Steve. You are amazing. I've worked in stroke unit, so understand what you may have gone through. And then thank you for sharing your experience. Good luck for you. If there are anyone else with any questions, please do fire them away now. You can also ask a live question if you'd like to. If you select raise your hand, we will come over to you and we'll be able to hear you. Won't be able to see you. We'll give it a few minutes just to see if there's any questions coming through from our speakers. But yeah, sorry, Steve.
Also, if I send you the two presentations, Neil, could you send it out to the people today?
I'll be able to send you the database if everyone's happy,
Oh,
and
cool.
then you're welcome
Yeah.
to send those out to people. Yes. There are no questions, Steve. But again, thanks so much for sharing. Have you got any? What would you like to leave our audience with today? Oh, hold on, 2 seconds. We've got a question come through. Thank you so much for sharing. What kept you going in those darker days? Did you have specific goals that kept you motivated?
Yeah, I've not known, I've not worked with, but I've been around people with learning disabilities since I was an infant. So having goals to be a volunteer for different organisations. I wrote so many publications before the stroke, and the team at Oxley's, they were so helpful that I actually published books supporting the health of people with learning disabilities. I didn't think I'd ever be able to do that, but we did, and it's still on sale, I think. Not that I'm benefiting from it, the money goes to Oxley's. Yeah, so having the goals of getting myself back on the publishing line, also advocating and volunteering for people with learning disabilities. Yeah.
Thank you.
And to meet Madonna, and to meet Madonna, I'm one step away. There's a lady called Kiara Lawrence who works for MenCap, who her cousin is the Edge from U2, and they contact each other. And thankfully, the manager of U2 also manages Madonna.
Okay.
So she contacted Madonna, but she hasn't replied.
Fingers
I
crossed.
doubt she ever will, but at least I'm only 2 steps away.
You're only 2 steps away. I mean, Steve, like you really do, like you really have kind of like, you're constantly kind of like working, you're an absolute social media machine, as well as kind of publishing. So it's just you are so inspiring in terms of kind of like that never stopping and just kind of like, keep going, keep fighting for people. And that sense of justice really shines through, having worked with you, since last year. So Padmini asked, if there is a family of a learning disabilities person and the family do not have LPA, can the family be a decision maker for the cervical screening?
No, it would be down to they would be consulted. If they don't have a lasting power of attorney or the deputy, it would be down to the actual person who's going to administer the treatment. But they would have to consult with the family.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. So that is all the questions we have time for. Another note coming in. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your story with us, and lots of thank yous. Anything you'd like to leave people with before we close off, Steve?
No, just make sure you join the next Positive Choices in early October, where the Keep Holding team will be making a wonderful presentation. And if you can look them up on Twitter or their YouTube, etc., they made a brilliant song. It's quite a comical video. So Cara Lawrence, who I mentioned, works for MenCap. Sally Phillips, some famous people with learning disability or without learning disability starred in that film. And I was actually in it with Peter.
You were. Norman Lamb was in there. It was amazing. Yeah. Well, that's actually so. After this, I will kind of like promote the YouTube playlist as well. Helen's asked me to advertise a talk that's taking place next week on Wednesday, the 15th of September at 5 p.m. It's a serious illness in children with Down syndrome, and that is a wonderful speaker apparently called Dr. Elizabeth Heraven. I believe I pronounced that right. And hopefully Elizabeth will be joining us in a couple of months to give one of these lunch and learns. Our next dates, I believe we are scheduled for the 7th of October, the 4th of November, and the 2nd of December, same times, but we'll promote those on the Facebook page. And before I go, I will just pop that Facebook page in the chat box. Please do open that, and then you'll see our past videos on there, as well as our YouTube playlist. So do check that out. Steve, thanks so much.
Cool, thank you.
And I hope to see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.